Hey guys, it's Will Newbegin here, and
Mike Gallagher.
and today we're going to be doing our PEP Talk. And for those of you that don't know, Mike and I really like music. So today we're going to be talking about 5 albums we absolutely love and a little bit why. So we're going to start things off here. In fact, actually, do you want to start with yours?
Yeah, sure. The first album I'm going to talk about probably the oddest and the hardest to get into, but it's The Money Store by Death Grips. This band kind of freaked me out for a really long time. I kind of considered them like a joke band or a meme band because most of their fans kind of regard the music in this kind of joking manner before I actually got what it was about. It's probably the oddest hip hop album I've ever heard. It's got industrial punk, just all this stuff on it that you wouldn't expect from a hip-hop album. It's kind of their fan favorite, and I now understand why. It's really catchy, but at the same time being really experimental, harsh on the ears. It's definitely a hard listen, but if you can kind of appreciate what they're doing and the catchiness of it all, it's a really fun album, which is weird because the lyrics are really violent.
Even as a fan of not that much. Yeah, I'm not that much of a Death Grips fan myself, but that's even an album that I can appreciate for what it is, and how musical really it can be. Similar is probably the most extreme, I guess, album that I have on my list, and that's Deaf Heaven's Sunbather. Deaf Heaven is a kind of an amalgamation of genres that don't necessarily sound like they would go together all that well. They mix elements of shoegaze, post-rock, and black metal all together.
It's the only black metal album I like.
Yeah, I would almost say it used to be the same way for me. But what I really appreciate about this album is this kind of reopened the world of metal for me, especially metal that's a little bit more extreme. And the way it does that, it's this I would almost describe it as pretty, and I guess it even has a degree of pop sensibility on it.
Yeah, a lot of major chords.
Yeah, it's very kind of upbeat for a metal album, which is very strange. And it has these soaring soundscapes with just really dynamic lyricism and vocal performances by singer George Clark. And the topics they cover on it are really cool too.
My next album is going to be probably the most important album in terms of influence on alternative music, The Velvet Underground and Nico by The Velvet Underground. This was a really cool time. This was they're from New York, very involved in kind of, I wouldn't say junkie culture, but definitely the seedier part of New York. And they
hung out with Lou Reed. So.
Yeah. And they got
Andy Warhol.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. They got involved with Andy Warhol. He did the cover art for this album. I know they would play gigs at certain shows he was hosting, and he brought Nico. She adds a really cool voice to the mix. This album, you can hear so many genres of alternative music in it, and it's from 1968 or something like that.
Yeah,
ridiculously ahead of its time. Really catchy songs like Venus and Furs, There She Goes Again, I'm Waiting for the Man, Femme Fatale.
And what I think is one of the cooler aspects of that album is just the array of instrumentation that it uses in it.
Lots of viola. John Cale does viola drones and stuff like that.
There's
some sampling.
There's Middle Eastern instrumentation on there, which
Venus
is really cool.
Especially. There's some sampling. I know on European Sun, there's a sampling of I think a car crash that completely scared me the first time I heard it because it's just so raw and primitive.
A similarly very keystone album in terms of composition and such that I would say is Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, which I consider my favorite record of all time, namely because I think it's one of the most talented groups of musicians that have ever come together to make a record. On that album you had John Coltrane and
jazz musician.
Mm-hmm. And Cannonball Adderley on the alto and tenor and alto sax, respectively, as well as Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on the drums, and Bill Evans and Wynton Kelly sharing piano duties, as well as Miles himself commanding with the trumpet. And what's really cool about this album is the emphasis it places on improvisation in that when they were writing the album, there wasn't really any sort of song structure that they, wrote out except for just basic scale patterns that each of them would kind of go over, and there was pretty much very little planning out of what was actually going to happen on the album. So I think that really highlights how talented each of the individual musicians' abilities. So.
My next album is going to be one of my favorite albums by one of my favorite bands. I actually have a T-shirt with this album on it.
So you know he likes them.
Yeah, Remain in Light by Talking Heads. This album was produced by Brian Eno, which we'll talk about later. Brian Eno at this time, this was the last of the 3 albums that he produced for the Talking Heads. So his kind of influence on the album is really cool. I know they did a lot of looping on this album, like actually like cut and sample looping, which is like really cool for like 1980s. And this came out in 1980, and it has a very new wave sound. Definitely ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it kind of retains a lot of like the African rhythms, the polyrhythms that they were working on Fear of Music. And like especially the first half of this album is ridiculously danceable. Like I will start dancing to a lot of these songs. There's like Born Under Punches, The Great Curve, and then probably my favorite Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime. It's just the quintessential.
It's so David Byrne.
Yeah.
It's just very quirky.
Just the lyrics, the quirkiness is just awesome.
His personality is like all on display there, which I really love.
Fantastic.
But
Speaking of Brian Eno.
Speaking of Brian Eno, he was a guy whom, my parents listened to a lot of new wave and Talking Heads and such growing up, and I had always kind of been exposed to his name, but I had never really kind of understood the full capacity of what he did for the music industry until I started listening to his music more heavily. So just as a record, this year he's releasing his 26th solo album, as well as more than 30 albums he's worked with other artists on, not to mention just countless albums that he's produced. But the album that I'm going to talk about of his that I love the most is his first of the ambient series, and that's called Music for Airports. So this was his 6th album at the time, and it was really unprecedented what he was doing, because he was taking this sort of style of classical composition and combining it with modern technology.
I actually thought he was a classical composer before I realized he was a producer, because I kind of looped him in with Philip Glass, Steve Reich.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize he worked with all these people like David Bowie, Talking Heads, Slow Dive, until later.
Yeah, no, he has a very minimalist, classical sort of angle to the way he writes out his instrument parts, but what's so revolutionary about this album is it takes those classical compositions and it loops them over a longer time span, like anywhere from 12 to 20 minutes, and it uses these loops that kind of surface in at different times, so you'll have a different instrument come in at a different time and then kind of fade out and give way to another, and it creates this really, really pretty soundscape that does exactly what the title of the album describes. And it's ambience, but it's not just that, it's very musical ambience.
Next album is actually an album that I got into through a documentary. Pitchfork has this really good series called Pitchfork Classics, where they basically do an hour on just a particular album. I know they did one on the South Fulton, Souvlaki. So I watched one on The Lonesome Crowded West by Modest Mouse, and before that, I kind of only thought of them through like Float On and their output in the 2000s. But this just sold me on how like raw and like wild their sound was back then. Like a lot of screaming, a lot of harmonics on the guitar, which I really like. And the fact that it was just a 3-piece back then, and how like big of a sound they had was really cool. And I actually really got to bond with this album because I got the CD stuck in my car for a week, so it's all I could listen to. So I really got to appreciate the full scape of the album. Polar Opposites, extremely catchy song. Trucker's Atlas, it's like 12 minutes, but it passes by so quickly. Just really catchy, great drumming on that one. And Cowboy Dan is a fantastic song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, what I've always appreciated about Modest Mouse, that, I've always just found them to be so much more, like, broad in what they attempted to do than a lot of the other indie rock contemporaries at the time.
Yeah.
But speaking of kind of broad experimentation as it pertains to indie rock, the next album I'm going to talk about is Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation.
Fantastic.
This is, in my opinion, by far the best Sonic Youth album, and one of the most unique sounding records I've ever heard. Now, they are often lumped into, kind of just very specific genres in music, and I don't think that's fair because this album especially puts all their bravado on display. On this, you have elements of drone, you have elements of noise rock, you have elements of hardcore punk, you have elements of spoken word. I mean, it's really, really broad. And what I think is the coolest aspect of this album is its devolution of, basic melodies and harmonies that were found in music at the time to just general noisiness. They use very oddly tuned guitars to create this kind of resemblance of a melody, but not quite a melody, that the songwriting is proficient enough to still use to carry this song.
It's like they took Dinosaur Jr. and hit it with a bazooka.
And then tried to put it back together. So it's really cool. Some of the lyrical concepts they talk about are just beyond me. Like, they talk about art films by Andy Warhol and such. It's really neat. Probably the best song, I would say, off this record is Teenage Riot.
It's a great album opener.
One of the better album openers I've ever heard.
And speaking of really good album openers, This Is Happening by LCD Sound System. First song on this album is what kind of drew me in. Dance Yourself Clean is one of the best songs I've ever heard, just of any genre. Extremely danceable. The first 3 minutes are it's not even, the band is it's like they're warming up and they're just kind of giving you a taste of what's to come. And then when the beat comes in, it is one of my favorite songs. The beat go on. And when the beat comes, it's just one of my favorite songs ever. This album I feel like I wouldn't have appreciated it if I had heard it 4 years ago, because a lot of these songs, they're really catchy, really immediate, but they do take patience. A lot of them, you wanted to hit 11 minutes, and even though it's really catchy, it's a very long song. So you kind of have to be along for the ride for the kind of dance punk, electronica kind of thing. And I mean, they emulate a lot of artists. They emulate definitely Talking Heads, Velvet Underground, also David Bowie on there. I'm pretty sure, not physically there, but a lot of influence. Some really good songs. Drunk Girls, One Touch. All I Want sounds a lot like Velvet Underground. And Home. Home's a really good album closer as well. It's just a solid album.
Really starts and ends on a high note.
Yeah.
And then the last album we're going to discuss is probably
now for something completely different.
Yeah, this is was like I say, the only rap album we'll be talking about today. But
Money Store.
Oh, true.
Money Store.
Well, but so this is definitely much more a conventional rap album than the Money Store.
Still chaotic.
But it's chaotic. It's like nothing I've ever heard. I don't think there's ever been an album that sounds like it since, and that's Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers by the Wu-Tang Clan. 9 guys rapping on this album. And, the chemistry that they all bring together. Well, that's even only 8, because Master Killa doesn't.
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
true.
because he's not on that. Just unparalleled chemistry. The fact that you have 9 guys and it doesn't get choppy at any point is really kind of amazing to me. And the fact that all 9 of them are ridiculously talented rappers, the guy I just mentioned before, Master Killa, he has 1 verse on the entire record and it's still one of the album's best. Also, there's these just lo-fi, grimy beats, just so gritty in nature, which was really cool because it was very stark contrast to some of the jazzy, soulful sounds on New York at the time, coming from acts like De La Soul, A Tribe Called Quest, and Pete Rock and CL Smooth.
The anti-De La Soul.
Yeah, pretty much. These guys are just hard hitting. They're very immediate in what they say. It spawned a lot of really, really good solo acts like Ghostface Killah, GZA, Raekwon the Chef, my personal favorite. But Protect Your Neck and Mystery of Chessbox, and definitely my favorite 2 songs on the record. So that should just about do it. That's 5 albums we each love.
Also, For Your Eyes Only.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But, yeah. This took a long time to keep it this short. But, all right.